Okay, as Ellie said earlier, the national vetting scheme in the UK has been in the news a lot last week. Particularly last Friday, it hit with media reports that parents who regularly ferry groups of children on behalf of sports and social clubs, such as the Cub Scouts, will have to undergo criminal record checks or face fines of up to £5,000. That was kind of the news story, which continued that these parents would fall under the scope of the government's new vetting and barring scheme, which is aimed at stopping paedophiles getting access to children. Failure to register with the Independent Safeguarding Authority, the Home Office agency which administers the scheme, could lead to criminal prosecution and a court fine. So this all kind of hit the press on Friday, and in a way it's quite interesting that it did, because it's not new news. As the development of the Independent Safeguarding Authority has been shaping up, it's become very clear that the scope of the national vetting scheme will be expanded to an ever wider range of people who have regular contact with children, whether that's employees or volunteers, parents or non-parents. But I thought it was interesting, the reaction that was provoked on Friday from the UK media in the kind of sense of, like, suddenly it was understood the implications that this would have for real life, you know, helpful parents who helped out with the Scouts and just sort of took kids around. And there was this kind of big outcry from everywhere from the Daily Mail to the NSPCC, again, quote Heather, a bit rich. And it was the kind of general sort of reaction could probably best be summed up along the lines of, yeah, well, we didn't think it would mean this. We knew there'd be something, but we didn't know it would mean this. So what I want to do here is really just explain why, from its inception, the national vetting scheme would always mean this. That the scheme contains an expansive logic which, if it were to continue, would formally mean that all adults would need a licence before interacting with children. And this has very significant and damaging implications for the way in which the generational responsibility of adults for children is conceived. So last year, Frank and I co-wrote this pamphlet called Licence to Hug, and this was really based on an investigation into the impact of the national vetting scheme upon adults volunteering to help out with children's groups. So people volunteered to run the Scouts or the Guides or youth football clubs or those kind of things. And at the time, vetting was conducted through a process of checks via the Criminal Records Bureau. And at that point, it already represented a significant shift from the relatively recent situation where people who work with children, such as teachers, were vetted. I mean, they were given checked against local police checks and against a blacklist called List 99. But volunteers weren't. And the CRB thing was very much of a kind of expansion of the process of who should be vetted and a change to the system of how they were vetted. Now we have the move towards the Independent Safeguarding Authority, which is kind of like the next stage on from that. And so what I really wanted to do here was go through the three main points that arose from the investigation that we conducted in Licence to Hug, and look at how that's developed over the subsequent year. The first point, just to really stress, is that the national vetting scheme is a political gesture rather than a genuine child protection measure. I mean, it is widely known that the system of kind of vetting, CRB checking, was brought in as a consequence of the Bichard inquiry into the Soham murders of 2002. It's also widely known that even if that system had been in operation, it wouldn't have prevented the murderer, Ian Huntley, from getting into contact with the children in the first place. I mean, I don't want to kind of dwell on this because I think it's widely known, but it was quite eloquently argued yesterday in the Times by Chris Stevenson, who headed the investigation into the Soham murders. Badly, in my view, I should say. But anyway, he wrote this article saying, which is kind of headlined, "This CRB check paranoia won't stop another Soham. I helped to catch Ian Huntley, and I know these stupid rules would not have prevented his crimes." So this is how widely known it is that the relationship between the Soham murders and the national vetting scheme is politically drawn. It's not a kind of obvious practical solution to those kind of problems. More to the point, I think, the very premise of the national vetting scheme is flawed, because with the best will in the world, rooting out people who have prior convictions for child sex offences in the past won't stop them from committing them in the future. I mean, there's just this obvious kind of contradiction to it. You can never prevent all kind of paedophiles from having access to children. You can never prevent all bad things from happening, because you can never tell what people might do. So, my very strong view is that the justification for the vetting scheme in relation to the Soham murders was a political gesture, or actually a PR gesture, I think you could say, which was about the government of the time showing willingness to do something in the light of this this national tragedy. In terms of child protection, in a kind of genuine sense, I've best heard it kind of summed up by Eileen Munro, who's a reader in social policy at the London School of Economics. She made the point that the national vetting scheme is a fantasy precaution representing the dangerous combination of a, quote, risk-averse society plus the fantasy that we can avoid risk completely. What I thought was very interesting conducting the work on this is how the reaction to understanding that this scheme couldn't work, because I think most people kind of got that point straight away, the reaction to understanding it couldn't work as intended led to actually a demand for something more expansive and more intrusive. I mean, it's only recently that anyone's kind of actually said, well, no, maybe we should think about pulling it back. Certainly in terms of the volunteers many of the volunteers that we interviewed, their main kind of frustrations were that they had to undergo several CRB checks for different organisations, and they kind of knew it wouldn't work anyway, and they had this sort of, and because there was general acceptance that indeed something needed to be done to try and prevent paedophiles from getting access to working with children, the focus then became on how it could be done better, more effectively and more efficiently. And in a way, this is what's led to the expansion of vetting under the Independent Safeguarding Authority. This is the first example of the expansive logic of this scheme. That what's being put into motion is a kind of is a central database, national vetting database, which will make it easier to update information about people and share it with relevant organisations. And it's kind of clear that this database, on the surface, will reduce some of the hassle for individuals having to undergo all of these checks. It will streamline things, generally make things more efficient in one degree. On the other hand, it does have very clear issues for civil liberties and security, and there's all manner of questions about who gains access to this database, how secure the information is, what kind of information is recorded, who needs to be on it. But there's a sort of a general sense of, well, this will make it easier and more effective. There's also an expansion of the individuals covered by the National Vetting Scheme, which will get rid of another anomaly, actually, which is why volunteers working with the Scouts need to be vetted, but parents giving lifts to children who aren't their own to go to Scout meetings don't need to be vetted. I mean, this is the kind of contradiction that is picked up by people. And this system will make it fairer, because basically anybody who's spending time with kids will need to be seen as equally suspicious. Then there's the kind of expansion of the information on the database, and I mean, this is something that I do need to do more work into, but many people have noted that the kind of shift from beyond kind of police convictions to kind of more soft intelligence then gets picked up in relation to this. And again, this is seen as, well, this is more effective because not all crimes lead to convictions, so we need to look at what was suspected, what was suspected about Ian Huntley, for example, that he never got charged for. I was recently talking to an employment lawyer who was saying that she's looking at the Independent Safeguarding Authority from an employment law perspective, and she was saying that employers will be legally obliged to report to the Independent Safeguarding Authority anything they pick up from their employees, like rumours, allegations, suspicions, all of that. Now, as I say, can't prove that yet, but I probably will in a few months. And it seems entirely within the logic of the scheme that this kind of thing will happen. And again, what you have through this is a kind of sense of, well, this will give more information that might be relevant. It will also, bring massive civil liberties implications and a major practical headache, because one can only imagine what happens to teachers, for example, about who they've all had rumours about them and things like that. If you end up in a situation where the scheme wants to record every kind of suspicion and every concern. So there are all manner of kind of problems with the implementation of the scheme sort of a year on. I think, however, the more important point in relation to child protection is actually the creation of the technical system itself, because I think what you've seen is the creation of a technical system for political purposes not only fails to protect children, because it can't actually do that, but I would argue it actively works to put them at risk of harm, because it discourages adults from taking responsibility informally for the children around them. And this leads to my second point, which is which relates to the trend towards responsibility aversion. See, one of the issues that we dwelt on in Licence to Hug was the extent to which the practical hassle of being vetted, alongside the degree of suspicion that the process encapsulated, was actively putting people off from volunteering to help out with children's activities. And we're not the only people who've made this point. Bernardo's made this point, and various other kind of surveys of volunteers. And it's not really surprising that that happens, because when looking at volunteers, you're looking at people who gain no financial reward through what they're doing. The reward is to do with kind of doing good and looking good and feeling good, if you like, in terms of what the extent to which there is a self-interest in it. So if the first thing that happens when you go to volunteer for something is that you're scrutinised for potential child sex offences, that's tantamount to putting up a sign to volunteers saying, well, keep out. We highlighted the dangers of this trend, and to the extent that it really promoted the idea that anybody wanting to help children out, either through volunteering or through just on an everyday level comforting a hurt child or helping a lost child just in the local community, it really kind of promotes the idea that the first thing adults should do is worry about covering their backs, and that kind of just then made it easier for adults to turn their backs, really, and to sort of think, oh, well, what will be the implications if I help? Well, I might look funny, someone might say something, so best leave it to someone else. And it really kind of fueled the idea that helping children was something that should be left to particular licensed adults, rather than helping children being assumed to be a general and generational responsibility. Now, I think with the development of the ISA and the expansion of those covered by the scheme, this situation gets worse, because you do have a situation where parents helping each other out or providing ad hoc assistance to schools or voluntary groups will be tacitly told to back off unless they have the appropriate clearance. Built into the scheme is really an assumption that the less you do, the better it is, because the more you do, if you're regularly taking children to cubs, that's when you have to undergo the check. And the whole basis of the problematisation of the regular assistance is the fact that if you put yourself in a position where you do things regularly, that makes children trust you. And it's making children trust you that makes you into a potential threat. And this is my third and final point, which I just want to look at, the conceptualisation of trust within the vetting scheme, and what it amounts to, which I would describe as a real perversion of the concept of trust between adults and children. Because there are presumably practical and pragmatic reasons why the Independent Safeguarding Authority does not yet insist that everybody who ever has contact with children should undergo the criminal records check, and instead confines its demands to those who have frequent, intensive or overnight contact with children. Presumably they're going to just say, well, it makes it a bit sort of smaller to manage. But the justification for pinpointing those who are in contact with children a lot is revealing, because as official guidance states, if the activity provides an opportunity for the person to develop a relation of trust with members of the relevant vulnerable group, that's when it needs to be regulated. So the rationale is that presumably children know to be wary of strangers. The problem arises when you have these wily paedophiles who get into a relationship of trust with them, and the children start to trust them and then become more likely to do their bidding. I mean, it's a similar kind of formulation to that which is used around internet grooming paedophiles online, that it's the relationship of trust itself that is the problem. And I think we should really consider what the implication is of applying the concept of trust as a problematic relationship as a standard to all regular contact between adults and children. Because the generational responsibility that adults have for children, the thing that gives it meaning and practical value, is that children trust adults to take decisions and take care of children and to do things in society. And adults, by the same token, trust other adults that they will engage with children and protect them. And this isn't a relationship that can be orchestrated via a process of certification, because it's not a transactional relationship between specific adults and specific children. It's an assumed arrangement between generations. So if this assumed relationship of trust breaks down as a consequence, for example, of a fear that adults get children to trust them as a means to doing children harm, then there is no wider generational responsibility between adults and any children who are not directly their own. Adults, as a group, are compelled to take a step back from helping children, socialising children and doing things with children. And the role of doing these things, and I think this relates to Heather's point, becomes more and more restricted to individual parents plus a selected certified group, about who, it should be noted, the capacity to trust is limited by the widespread knowledge that the licensing process might sometimes get things wrong, so you can never be too sure anyway. So, just to conclude, I think this perversion of the concept of intergenerational trust is the key achievement of the National Vetting Scheme to date. And whatever happens with the policy in the future, it will be very difficult to unmake what is fast becoming common sense, that really all adults should be licensed before they're permitted to care for children.